In the previous video, I addressed various schools of psychology, specific structuralism, Gestalt psychology, behaviorism, and also psychoanalysis. In the second video addressing the different schools of psychology, I will address two specific schools, not necessarily in sequence from the previous schools, but rather as distinct entities. The two schools of psychology I will discuss this evening are both functionalism and also cognitive psychology. Particularly, I'll focus on the cognitive revolution. When psychology began to establish itself as a science, somewhat different or somewhat separate from biology, anatomy, astronomy, and also separate from philosophy, there was a debate about how to not only describe the human mind, but also behavior itself. Initial school that was developed from this interest was the school of structuralism. And in the previous video, I discussed that Wilhelm Wundt was the founder of structuralism. He founded that school in the late 1850s at the University of Leipzig in Leipzig, Germany. And indeed, for a long period of time, the structuralist movement was the predominant force in psychology. While structuralism was the first school of psychology, and as it focused on breaking down components into very basic parts, or rather breaking down mental processes into basic parts, they used introspection. And while it had several strengths, one of the main criticisms was that the experimental method used to study the structure was very subjective, and it was also very unreliable. Other critics indicated that structuralism was too concerned with internal processes, internal thought processes, and likewise you could not directly observe or measure behaviors. And of course, in response to that, you had the behaviorist movement. However, prior to the behaviorist movement, you had the advent of functionalism. Functionalism was very heavily influenced by William James. And of course, William James was somewhat influenced by the work of Charles Darwin. James felt that functionalists sought to understand mental processes in more of a systematic fashion, rather than focusing on individual elements of consciousness. Functionalists instead chose to examine the purpose of consciousness and behaviors. William James, furthermore, sought to expand the science of psychology towards practical application. One of the main focuses of his research, of his initiatives, were applying psychology to the field of education. For example, he created some very seminal books called Talks for Teachers. Early functionalist thinkers at the turn of the 1900s were not only William James, but also John Dewey, John Angell, and Harvey Carr. All of these individuals have not only had an influence on the functionalist school, but also on educational psychology. And while the functionalists had multiple strengths, such as their influence on both behaviorism and applied psychology, and also their influence indeed on the educational system itself, it had numerous criticisms, rather critics. One of the big critics of functionalism is that it offered a base of literature, but it was not psychology. In fact, Wilhelm Wundt had a quote, "Functionalism is literature, it is beautiful, but it is not psychology." And indeed, the functionalists had leaders, they had a movement, they had some type of application of this science of psychology. However, they lacked the ability to establish a specific methodology, a specific purpose, and indeed the functionalist movement began to fade with the advent of the behaviorists. Speaking of as behaviorism began as a response to the functionalists and also the structuralists, around the 1950s you began, even the 1940s, you began to have a response to not only functionalism but also behaviorism. And you began to have the advent of the cognitive revolution. Before we talk about the cognitive revolution, it's important to discuss the word cognition. Cognition within itself refers to any type of mental processes that cannot be defined as outward visible behaviors. I mean, like for example, I may respond to pain through some type of grimace, however, or I may have intelligence in order to solve problems, and my perception of the pain and my interpretation of the pain, and likewise my ability to solve the problems, anything that is not observable would be referred to as cognition itself. Cognitive psychology had an influence through many individuals. Some of the individuals that influenced the initiation of psychology was Carl Lashley. Carl Lashley had presented a situation in which he wanted to confront behaviorism, specifically on stimulus response chains. He felt that they could not adequately explain behavior, but rather something was happening within the individual that needed to be examined further. Such things as slips of the tongue could not be explained simply by stimulus response behaviors. Other individuals that had a tremendous influence on the cognitive revolution was George Miller. George Miller's primary research interests were on speech and hearing and memory. And I had a classic study called The Magic Number 7 plus or minus 2. Some limits on our capacity for processing information. And then he conducted a very seminal study in which he determined that individuals, rather humans, can remember approximately seven items. Some individuals 5, other individuals 9. Therefore, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. It was a very pivotal study in enabling psychological science to understand that there indeed were limits to cognition, but also that cognition could indeed be examined empirically. Other individuals, such as Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky was interested in language development. B.F. Skinner in the late 1950s had written a book called Verbal Behavior, in which he explained language development as a sole function of stimulus responses. Chomsky offered alternative theories regarding language acquisition. He argued that such things as syntax, grammar, could not be explained through a behavioral standpoint, and indeed he can be credited as a leader in the cognitive revolution. Other individuals would include Jerome Bruner, and also Frederick Bartlett, and indeed another individual from a more contemporary standpoint would be both John Piaget, Ausubel, David Ausubel, and even more recently the work of Herbert Simon. And of course, Herbert Simon, while he did have interest in such fields as political science and public administration, he had tremendous impact on such fields as artificial intelligence and also decision making. While the field of cognitive psychology has indeed had a revolution in the 1950s, the revolution has not ended. With the advent of computers, with the advent of artificial intelligence, with the advent of neuroimaging, the field of the cognitive revolution has not yet reached its heyday, but still is in a burgeoning development. This will end my 2 videos on the schools of psychology.